Hello and welcome to Patriot Paths. My name is Lake Green and I'm so excited to be back here today for yet another lecture video in my special fall 1776 lecture series where we will discuss and are discussing the most important and pivotal campaign, in my opinion, in American history. If things don't go the way they do in fall of 1776, if Washington and the Continental Army don't stay together despite enduring decimating defeats and just almost everything short of a complete collapse, and they really should have endured a collapse and a disintegration, they somehow are able to beat in the final straws, in the final seconds of the campaign, the most powerful force on the face of the earth in the British Army. And if we don't win here, whether it's by luck, whether it's by God, miracle, whatever, we don't have a country. As always, I can only talk so much in a 10-minute video, so please, if you want more information, check out David McCullough's 1776 novel. It is a phenomenal work. It's such a great book. It's accessible. It's really easy to read. If you want more information, please check that out. On November 16th, 246 years ago today, Fort Washington would fall to the British. It would be, by some standards, the worst American defeat of the entire American Revolution, maybe only second to the fall of Charleston in 1780 in South Carolina, but that's questionable. Over 3,000 American troops would be killed or captured, and the last bastion of American resistance on Manhattan Island would be crushed by the British Army. Following the Battle of White Plains on October 28th, William Howe and his British Army decided to turn southward and march towards Manhattan. Their goal is indeed to capture Fort Washington, which is the last American stronghold in Manhattan. They're attempting to just crush any resistance and fully secure New York for the British. Washington had hoped, after retreating northward after White Plains, that Howe would pursue him further upstate into New York. Realizing that Howe has no reason to do this and won't do this, Washington hastily decides to pursue him south. Along the way, he leaves behind many New England units and many militia units to guard vital supply depots and strategic locations in upstate New York that he doesn't want to leave open to the British. He does this because he feels that if New York is abandoned completely in the event that things go south to Manhattan, which he probably anticipates are going to happen, he does not want to lose possession of upstate New York, because if the British are able to control all of New York State, they'll be able to cut the New England colonies off from the mid-Atlantic colonies, and that will be a bad thing. You'll lose a lot of land and the ability to really have a conjoined and unified war effort. Due to this decision to leave a lot of men behind at outposts, his numbers grow thinner and thinner. Washington needs men. His army had over 20,000 men when they first arrived in August in Brooklyn. Now, they're in the tens of thousands and getting lesser and lesser every single day. Thinned by disease, by killed and wounded, by loss in battle, and also by desertions, mass desertions of a lot of these militia units that weren't Continental Army units in the regular army that signed monthly contracts. These militia units were free to come and go as they pleased. A lot of the men just, after a battle, would just go right back home. So there was no way to know his full strength because men were always coming and going out of the army as they pleased. As far as the Continental regulars go, Washington and a lot of his men are already leaving because of expiring enlistments. They enlisted for 6-month and 1-year terms, and a lot of these men's enlistments are expired, and the men are just going home. And despite this, in only a couple months, pretty much all of his enlistments will expire, and his entire army will pretty much disintegrate and be reduced to nothing. It's a very bad situation. Nonetheless, Washington is determined to continue to push on and try to halt the British victories and stem the tide of the British, just momentum in New York. He marches south hastily to get to Fort Washington. Fort Washington is in Manhattan, as I said, and across from Fort Washington is Fort Lee. Both of these forts are positioned on the Hudson River, with Fort Lee in New Jersey and Fort Washington in New York. These forts were built in the summer of 1776 with the intention that they would be able to hold the Hudson River at that high, on a high slope where both forts are like very high up on palisades, on an impasse, on a very high pass, to try to prevent the British Navy from being able to sail up the Hudson with impunity. Unfortunately, the Americans realized very soon that British ships can go up and down the river with ease, and it doesn't matter how many cannons and artillery units they have in Fort Lee, but they really aren't of much effect to the British Navy. Due to the fact that he's lost pretty much all of New York, and Fort Washington is the only remaining bastion in Manhattan, and the Hudson River is pretty much neutralized for the British, Washington believes in his heart that Fort Washington serves no vital purpose anymore and should be abandoned. Although he feels this, he trusts Nathaniel Greene, the second in command there, under him, or third in command, I guess, under Charles Lee, one of his most senior officers, and in command of the garrison overall at Fort Washington. He asks Nathaniel Greene what he should do. He actually orders him, if practicable, to abandon Fort Washington, but doesn't, explicitly state that he has to do it. He leaves it to his own discretion. Nathaniel Greene confers with the fort's commander, Colonel Robert McGaw, and McGaw states that he thinks that the fort can be held and that it shouldn't be abandoned. So due to the fact that McGaw tells him that he thinks he can hold the fort, Nathaniel Greene, against his better judgment, tells Washington, I'm going to hold on to the fort. Even though Washington's not crazy about the idea and questions it, he respects Greene so much and says, okay, I'll listen to you. Unfortunately, Greene will make a devastating error. On November 16th, the British forces under William Howe, in combined correlation with the British Navy, attack Fort Washington. At this time, there are 3,000 men inside Fort Washington. Nathaniel Greene had some 2,000 men left there before the army marched to White Plains, and about another 1,000 men arrive as they straggle southward and are reinforced at the fort as the American army retreats from White Plains. These 3,000 men are now defending the fort and the fields and area around the fort. The inside of the fort is well fortified with a lot of cannons, redoubts, and a lot of ammunition supplies. The outside of the fort is actually defended by some trench lines and earthwork positions along with a few redoubts, trying to be like an advanced position that would delay prevent the enemy from getting right up on the fort right away. On November 16th, the British attack in 3 prongs. In one prong, General Hugh Percy leads British and Hessian soldiers. In the other prong, General Lord Cornwallis leads completely British soldiers and light infantry. In the third prong, a Hessian general, von Kniphausen, leads a completely German force to attack the fort. 3 prongs attack the 3 land sides of the fort. On the ocean or the river side of the fort, a British frigate known as the HMS Pearl sails up the river and starts heavily bombarding the fort from the Hudson River. Washington, right before the attack arrives, actually goes to Fort Washington, arrives on the scene with General Nathaniel Greene and General Putnam, and asks McGaw about the state of his defenses. While Washington is in the fort, the battle quickly ensues. Eventually, things deteriorate so fast that Washington retreats with Nathaniel Greene and his generals and General Hugh Mercer across the Hudson River to Fort Lee. Using binoculars, Washington eagerly watches the condition of the battle across the river. The battle started in the early morning hours, and by the early afternoon, things continue and start to rapidly deteriorate. On the eastern on the eastern and southern approaches to the fort, the defenses fold completely and easily. A lot of men are outside the fort. They try to hold off the British and Hessian advance. They're completely routed. They retreat into the fort, and this causes an overcrowded mass of thousands of men start to become bottled up in this little area that is the inside the walls of the fort, which is not good. Only one area of the defense is actually stubbornly holding its own against the Hessians, and that is the northern defenses, led by Lieutenant Colonel Moses Rawlings, Maryland and Virginia riflemen from high grounds using rocks and natural barriers as cover, snipe at the advancing Hessian soldiers. The Hessian soldiers take heavy casualties from these riflemen, and these riflemen stubbornly hold their own in the face of overwhelming odds for a considerable amount of time. Unfortunately, they run low on ammunition, their weapons jam, and the Hessians, angry and incensed by the death of many of their comrades and the stubborn resistance the enemy shows, when they finally get to the top of the crest of the American positions, they bayonet and slaughter all of the riflemen mercilessly, killing them even as they try to surrender. As far as the other two sides of the fort, the men retreat inland. The British continue to bombard from the sea. Washington worriedly watches, and he sends over an officer named Captain John Good, I believe. And Gooch goes over across Fort Lee on a boat. Mr. Gooch arrives and tries to give Colonel McGaw, a letter from Washington ordering him to hold the fort at all costs until nightfall, hoping Washington in his mind that if by some way McGaw can hold on until dark, Washington can get boats from Fort Lee and in the dead of night have another miracle evacuation and get his men out of there in the morning. Washington would not be so lucky, because at this time, just as his messenger arrives within the fort, Hessians come along the banks of the Hudson River and completely surround the fort, cutting off the waterway escape for the Americans. They are now surrounded on all sides and have absolutely nowhere to go. He's ordered to surrender. Howe orders Colonel Johann Rall to send a messenger into the fort asking the men to surrender. McGaw debates and then finally accepts his term. Unfortunately, over 3,000 Americans would be killed, wounded, or captured. Some 2,800 would be captured. About 200, a little less than 200 would be killed and wounded. The Hessians would suffer heavy casualties, several hundred, and the British would suffer a couple hundred casualties as well. But it's nothing in comparison to the thousands of Americans and over 30 cannons that are now captured by the British Army at Fort Washington. The exact casualty numbers will be appearing on your screen right now. And now, in the aftermath of the battle, the American army has lost thousands of men. Washington, with Nathanael Greene, stands in utter silence. He will never again trust Greene for months. He will no longer trust Greene for months. And Greene actually is so embarrassed and devastated by his faulty decision to hold on to Fort Washington, that it haunts him for the rest of his career. But he'll redeem himself at the end of the war, really being a major reason for why we win the war, leading the Southern campaign that eventually will lead to the British surrender in Yorktown, Virginia. So Greene will redeem himself in the future, but right now it's a devastating, dark defeat for the Americans. Washington's army, that is now already disintegrating before his eyes, starving, was already low on clothes and provisions, now has lost almost all their heavy artillery, is exhausted, is in rags, and now has no choice but to regroup and retreat through New Jersey. The next battle and video will be on the capture of Fort Lee across the Hudson River. Thank you so much for watching. Rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time on Patriot Pats.